Baroness Scott, your committee have been looking at the issues of food waste and what can be done in the EU to reduce food waste. What were the key findings?
Well, the first thing that really struck us was that actually it's quite difficult even to define food waste, never mind to measure and monitor it and count it. And that surprised us. But nevertheless, we think the scale of the problem is so big that we do need urgent action and that we shouldn't wait until we can kind of, dot all the I's and cross all the T's. We need to start acting on it now. And we've identified actions at a range of levels from consumers right up to the European Commission. Where we think there's a really important job for the Commission is encouraging member states to start taking this seriously. And also because we found that there's actually quite a lot going on around the EU, but it's uncoordinated and it's often not strategic. So we think there's a real role for the Commission in beginning to pull all that together. And we also think that the Commission can be doing quite a lot more to look at its own legislation and just check that there aren't unintended consequences, things like date labelling rules, for example, to make sure that they're not inadvertently making the food waste problem worse.
How big a problem is food waste in the UK and also in the industrialised world more generally?
In the UK, we're wasting about 15 million tonnes of food every year. We know that's a pretty accurate figure because we're actually quite good at measuring it here. It gets a bit more difficult outside. It's about 90 million tonnes we estimate across the EU, and industrialised countries about 222 million tonnes. And to put that into context, that's pretty much equal to the total food production of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a significant problem, and that's why we think it needs to be tackled urgently.
The committee call on retailers to play a bigger role in reducing food waste. I think you heard evidence from Tesco's and Waitrose, for example. What should the supermarkets be doing to improve their performance?
Well, I think first of all, the committee recognises and really values the fact that supermarkets have become much more aware of the food waste issue in recent years. So, that's a good thing. But we do think that there's a lot further that they can go, recognising that they're kind of at the centre of the supply chain, kind of between the growers and producers of food and the consumers. So, just to give you one example, a lot of farmers now only have a contract with one supermarket. They usually face pretty heavy penalties if they don't grow enough. So the obvious thing to do from their point of view is to grow more than you think you'll need. Well, then if the supermarket doesn't need it, the farmer then has no market for it and it'll get ploughed in. And a similar thing happens if supermarkets simply decide that they don't want as much lettuce or as many tomatoes as they first thought. It's the farmer and the grower who ends up being sort of stuck with the surplus and not really having alternative markets. They're usually just wasted. So, we think there's a really important issue about the nature of the relationships between growers and farmers on one hand and the supermarkets on another. So that would be one key area. We're also very keen that supermarkets recognise their sort of educational role with consumers, and that's particularly about how important the correct packaging is, correct storage of food, issues about the dates, the best before and the use by dates and so on, and those sorts of areas where I think a bit more attention with kind of helping consumers to understand that would be a really important role for supermarkets. One of the things we heard from Tesco's, which we welcome, is that they're bringing the buy one get one free offers to an end, and we heard a lot of evidence about how wasteful that can be because it just encourages consumers to buy more than they can realistically use. So we do welcome that. And we also heard a lot from Waitrose about what they're doing with relation to food banks. Now, I know food banks are controversial and the committee doesn't come to a judgment about food banks themselves, but nevertheless, it would appear at the moment that there's more incentive to put food into anaerobic digestion than there is to see whether it can be used for food banks or other charitable purposes. So we'd really like the government to take another look at that, because we believe that food that's produced for people to eat should, wherever possible, be eaten by people.
Beyond the economic impact of food waste, what about the environmental damage? How big a problem is that?
I think the real question is actually about waste, and when you throw a piece of food away, it's not just about that piece of food, because what that food has gone through is a process that's required land, it's required water, chemicals, fertilisers, carbon emissions have been generated in transporting it and processing it, labour costs. I mean, you know, it's a lot of money that's kind of embedded in every piece of food that we throw in the bin. Now, everything we know about resources worldwide, from water to land and so on, is that it's becoming more scarce. And therefore, for us, you know, I mean, of course there is a moral dimension to all this about throwing away good food. But above all, it really is a waste of precious resources, and that's why we think it needs to be tackled urgently.